All right, Oliver is unmuted. Here we go. I did have breakfast. I actually had cinnamon rolls that I made last night, and so
And you didn't invite us?
I did not homemade, like from the can. It was not, but they were pretty fresh and they were better than the store like Cinnabon. So I would say yes. Um, Well, I mean, I think that some of them are really, really sweet, and I can't always like finish a whole one of those, but at least with these, they were small, and I was like, yes, this is bite size. I can handle this for a breakfast situation.
Testing, testing. There we go.
You said unofficially, and then I would probably get reached out to like a little interview.
So I would say at the end of the fall. Exactly.
Audience microphone. Okay, happy with this. Yeah, you gotta flip this up. Just hold it till the lights go out.
And the benefit there is that, you could get a letter from somebody in the department that we can then compare also, and then we can add that to the one we already have from, outside. It just builds your case up for funding, et cetera. Yeah.
And there's funding for master's students?
There is the potential, if we have funding, to use them for master's
I
students.
understand.
So, yeah.
That I'd find out the end of April.
Exactly. So basically the way this works is that.
Oh, while I've got you here, I can interrogate you about the plastics workshop. So the 15th, everything is should work out well. The only issue is that Lee and I are both going to be out of town.
Okay.
And so we're going to ask if you guys would be able to designate a point person for the Athenaeum, because usually like Lee and I are in here to like.
Yeah, but it's an all virtual event.
Oh, it's an all virtual.
Yeah.
But in
Okay.
the meantime.
Well, then we don't even have to come here.
Yeah.
Okay.
No point.
Okay. Then I'll report back to them and say we don't even need a point
Yeah, it's
person
all
because it's all virtual. Okay. So then I'll put that in the announcement as well.
Yeah, and do you make sure that there's the registration link for
Yep.
the announcement?
Absolutely.
Say,
Okay.
I mean, I
Yeah,
think
because I have the.
Bill would be
Yeah.
around.
Here it is. Okay. Cool. Then that makes our lives easier.
Good, yeah.
Thanks.
It's hard to say. I mean,
I think it's March 2nd.
I would say it's
Oh, yeah. I think the first is Friday.
we have 16. Oh, no, we have 20 something.
Yeah,
It's
Excluding the Northern Virginia.
Yeah, it's usually like in the below 30, I would say.
Last year, and my cohort is
donors.
Right, I don't, they don't
Are
have to
you
fund
keeping
me,
in
so
contact
accepting me is easy.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Or it's just kind of like a, okay, like I look at the calendar and I'm like, the numbers is going down.
I think so, yeah. Do you know Will? Him?
Yeah.
Okay, Will is in the, not a blank on the name of the institution, it's the intelligence.
Oh, Hume Center,
Hume
yes.
Center. Over in CRC.
Somebody was talking to me about that at the social the other day.
Yeah.
asking me about that.
He's
Gonna do the same thing I am.
same
using-
thing,
using this-
exactly.
this status
He's
that- that-
a Naval Academy grad. I think he was in the Marines. I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, yeah, about 20%.
Oh, okay. From it, so they can pick from any of the academies, or is it mostly
No,
the
the
only
Naval
Naval
Academy
Academy?
does both Navy and.
Oh, got it.
No desire to quit. That was not. I did what I wanted to do.
Right. Oh, yeah, I saw it. I'm used to this.
I'll sit by you once I'm on camera in my suit. I guess you prefer that.
And I wasn't sure if it would be really.
I had Navy beans.
I don't want to bring my lunch, but
I don't know, I had Navy bean soup for lunch. I'm good with bean soup.
My email changed in the middle of.
It's appropriate for you.
Yeah, because
I didn't make it. I didn't make it.
Yeah, I was like in the middle of.
My wife, the awesome cook.
And I was like, I saw that one. But she had some comments, so
spicy chili dish Japan.
everywhere, so I mean, it's not expensive, but I feel like that.
That's what.
Have you been in the past?
You can actually incorporate, you can actually get like chili,
Oh, okay.
chili flavored.
Anita's here. Anita, connect again.
That question I just find amusing.
I have a strong preference.
The things that people
I
hear
am so nervous.
Oh, no.
It's okay, we won't be
Once
hard
you
on
get
you.
started.
I keep saying, I said you're gonna do great.
I'm like levitating.
And what Daniel said,
This is a lot of stress.
so I checked this morning and I still didn't, maybe not.
I'm still suffering through that.
It'll stop sending it to you.
It literally in the middle of my email and it went. Like, okay, I guess this.
So make sure you open out pizza points, but one day I just stopped.
All right, Joe, are we good to go? All right. Are we unmuted on Zoom and everything?
Un moment,
Okay.
you're gonna get out of here.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to call us to attention real quick. Thank you for coming to the seminar today. And hello to folks on Zoom. I'll be moderating today in place of Lee. And Fernanda's here as well. So yes, we're very excited. And I'm actually going to hand it over to Daniel to introduce our speaker today, our first dissertation seminar of this semester, which is very exciting.
Yes, thank you, Oliver. Thanks, everyone, for being here. So as the advisor of our speaker today, I really wanted to make sure that I could say something about Pratyusha. She came to us with a master's in public policy from Rutgers and was actually enrolled in public policy at Virginia Tech when she discovered STS. And there was not a time that I knew Pratyusha that she was not focused on this issue and the problems that she's going to talk about today. That is, she was driven and knew she wanted to look at sustainability issues related to the global fashion industry and really had a sense that STS could make a really interesting new contribution to understanding this really important policy problem and an important justice issue. I just want to point out two things about the work here that before I turn it over to Pratyusha that I think should be highlighted. And one is really the creative way that she brings together concepts from different fields and sees how they map onto one another. That is the supply chain on one hand, and then the STS language of socio-technical systems, and how those are two sides of the same coin. And so this allows her to really address a broader set of discussions and literatures. And the second is really the amazing interviews. And Pratyusha became an expert interviewer, made trips to India and was on site with the people that she interviewed. And really, I think this work really shows how interviewing on site in an ethnographic sort of approach really allows one to reveal a hidden world. And I hope that comes out in this work. I'm sure it will. Pratyusha.
So thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to my dissertation seminar. So the focus of my topic is going to be what are some of the sustainability transition barriers in the fast fashion industry, but from the perspective of the supply chain. So initially, just a brief overview of how I got into this specific topic. So back in 2018, I read this article where luxury brands like Burberry and Louis Vuitton were burning off over 500 million worth of their inventory because they wanted to maintain exclusivity in the market. And there were also a lot of fast fashion companies that were burning their clothes instead of repurposing them or recycling them because it was just cheaper to do so. So once I read about it, I went into the rabbit hole of trying to understand how emissions are associated with it. And then I came across the impacts of fast fashion and the significant impact it has on the labor and the environment at the same time. So I want to start by introducing what exactly fast fashion is. So fast fashion is mainly a business model where brands and retailers prioritize rapid production of low-cost clothing or cheap clothing, which are mainly inspired by the runway shows of luxury brands and also some of the real-time data which they collect to inform them more about their trends. Some of the key characteristic of fast fashion businesses is that they are cheap and affordable. They are produced within a very short time frames, and their trends are frequently updated, which is they have around 52 micro trends every year, which is new collections are being launched every week of the year. So this again makes one of the key aspects of the business model to be short production times. One of the ways these businesses have been able to do this is by incorporating a buyer-driven supply chain. And what a buyer-driven supply chain means is that major retailers or large brands would set up decentralized production networks, mainly in developing countries, where the labor cost is very cheap and the population is very high. Considering that this is a very labor-intensive industry, it really works out in their favor when they outsource their entire production process to some of these developing nations. So this is how typically a supply chain of a fast fashion business looks like. And as you can see, some of the main characteristic or some of the main functions of the brand itself is only to design and do the material planning and just take care of the marketing, sales, and some of the financial services. But when they do outsource their production to the factories mainly based out of India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and China, they look for a few key capabilities for their production units. Some of them being their quick production capabilities, which is how quickly they can produce these items. their delivery times, which is how quickly they can deliver all of these products, how affordable they are, and the product variability, which is how many different types of products can a certain factory make. And once we get into the manufacturing, we see that the manufacturers themselves are very strategically positioned in a way that they are connected to the brands, but they are also connected to contractors and subcontractors who do some of the work for them, because most of the manufacturers do not do the complete end-to-end production for a ready-made garment, but they are connected to suppliers who supply them fabrics and subcontractors who might be doing a small part of the production. And at the bottom of the supply chain, we see that there is mainly like garment workers, which all of these actors are linked to. And then once the product is eventually made, it hits the distribution channels and eventually the retail shelves. So what is the problem exactly with fast fashion? So we see that this significant social impact of fast fashion mainly arises from brands prioritizing low cost and rapid production. And this approach mainly leads to low wages for workers, child labor, and unsafe working conditions, and also health risks for the workers. And this emphasis on quick production means that workers often face intense pressures to meet tight deadlines, which leads to, again, long working hours and increased stress on workers. In addition to quick production, low prices is also one of the key characteristics of this business model, and we see that to keep the prices low, manufacturers may cut costs in areas like wages and safety measures and also work benefits, which usually results in poor wages and substandard working conditions. Another aspect which I do want to point out with the social footprint of this industry is that 80% of the workers in this industry are female workers. So when we talk about health risks, there are significant health risks involved, because there have been reports of female workers losing their fertility because of the dyeing process and the chemical effluents involved in the production process of fast fashion garments. But also in terms of social impact, we see that there is also a lot of gender-based violence against these female workers, and there are also reports of sexual violence against some of these workers. In addition to the social footprint of this industry, there is also a very significant environmental footprint which is there. And as fast fashion encourages frequent purchasing of inexpensive clothing, it leads to overconsumption and textile waste. In addition to that, the production cycle itself are very high energy consuming. So there is a significant carbon footprint and emissions which are involved in the production process. But also the dyeing and finishing process of the garments also makes this industry the second most polluting industry in the world, which contributes to 20% of the global wastewaters. So after this industry was heavily criticized by a lot of policymakers and advocacy groups, some of the ways this industry has incorporated sustainability is through pledges and coalitions, being brands pledging to reduce their emission in a specific period of time. And another measure has been better disclosures in their annual reports, which was a step towards increasing the accountability and transparency in the supply chain. Another aspect of sustainability here are completely alternative business models that are involved, some of them being renting, thrifting, and also recycling in certain cases. The fourth and the most important one is certifications, which I will discuss in the next few slides. And these certifications and compliances are mainly applied to the production side of the supply chain. So, just to give a brief overview of some of the previous literature that has been done in this area, the literature has demonstrated that the sustainability solutions are not being implemented fast enough to offset the negative impacts of this rapidly growing industry. But they have also shown that the fashion industry is locked into these unsustainable trends and is resistant to change or is resistant to any of the sustainability measures that have been implemented so far. They have also pointed out that there is a need in the fashion literature to research more on the involvement of how the actors who are outside the regions of Europe and North America might be contributing to this, and a need for a more in-depth interdisciplinary investigation with these actors. In addition to this, some of the ethnographic works that have been done in this area have mainly focused on speed, sourcing, and the supplier management part of it. So this study mainly tries to address how some of these sustainability barriers can be removed, or what are some of the key challenges to it. So the first objective of my study, as I just mentioned, is to understand how the barriers to a more sustainable system are, but also to highlight the viewpoint and the perspective of actors who are actually part of the production supply chain from the global south, in this case, specifically India. The theoretical framework which I use for this study is the multi-level perspective, and this is an approach mainly to studying sustainability transitions, and it has a background in evolutionary economics, social construction of technology, and institutional theory. This is an analytical approach to understanding large-scale socio-technical transitions. So there are three main levels in this framework, but one of the main levels which I do talk about is the socio-technical regimes. And under the regimes, there is this very interesting concept of socio-technical configurations, which mainly refers to these interlinked heterogeneous elements that work towards fulfilling a certain function. And the elements in a socio-technical configurations are interconnected to each other, which makes the transition towards sustainability or new radical technologies even harder to break through. And this is what the regime mainly signifies, because it has these set of semi-coherent rules and cognitive routines that are that orient themselves to the activities of the social groups in a system. These rules are embedded mainly in institutions and infrastructures through the manufacturing processes, product characteristics, the production technologies, and so on. One of the reasons why it is very difficult to break through a regime is because of these locked-in pathways. And we have these locked-in pathways because there are regulations, infrastructure, policies, and user practices that are aligned with existing technologies that make this reconfiguration more resistant to change. The other two levels are mainly the landscape level, which mainly refers to the external environment that is beyond the influence of the regime. And it mainly incorporates the broader structure of slowly changing external factors like economic patterns or environmental problems and normative values. The last part is the niches, which are mainly protected spaces or incubated spaces for new technologies. For this study, I mainly focus on the socio-technical regime, and the way I have equated it with the fast fashion regime is through this industrial pyramid, where brands are at the top of the pyramid with the lowest risk and accrue the highest amount of profit because they do not own any of the factories, compared to the labor which has the highest risk, including health risk and unsafe working conditions and low compensation, in the bottom of the supply chain. So just to move on to the methodology of the study, I wanted to understand what were some of the operational barriers to moving towards a more sustainable system. So I decided to conduct ethnographic interviews with manufacturers of fast fashion companies, but also some of the industry experts who have been in this industry and have been working with different advocacy groups for the past 10 years. One of the reasons to conduct ethnographic interviews was to understand truly what some of the intricacies of global trades are and how there are some of the challenges in actually incorporating these sustainability benchmarks. The fieldwork was mainly done in the garment factories, which were located in Jaipur, Mumbai, and Delhi. Initially, it started off, the interview started off on Zoom, but none of the manufacturers would sit over 10 minutes to actually do the interview because they do work in a very fast-paced environment. So I just decided to just go there and show up at the factory to actually get them to talk to me. And they were a lot more comfortable with me recording all the interviews when I was in person compared to when it was on Zoom. So it took place in fall of 2022, and I was there for about 4 weeks. And these are just some of the images from the factories which I took. The first image mainly was in a factory where they were hand block printing the fabrics, and they were air drying it because they thought it was a lot more cost efficient for them to air dry it rather than invest in a tumble dryer for the factory. And the second image is of a manufacturing unit based in Jaipur, and this was the place where most of the people were working. And as you can see, it is a very labor-intensive industry because there are not a lot of machines used in the garment making process, but the main pieces of technologies used are just the sewing machine and the machines which are used for closing the seams of the fabrics. And the third picture is just some of the samples of their hand block print fabrics which they were using to actually pitch for Zara's home decor line. So moving on to the findings of the study, there are 3 main sets of findings which I want to focus on in this presentation. One of them are related to the manufacturing challenges with fast fashion companies, which a lot of these actors and manufacturers faced when they were working with these brands. And the first one was the pressures and the stress involved with fulfilling order deadlines and the tight deadlines associated with this industry. So manufacturers claimed that they face immense pressure to fulfill orders within these tight deadlines imposed by retailers. And this pressure mainly stems from this industry's emphasis on producing low-price clothing with rapid production cycles. Because there is significant emphasis on short production times, it was seen that manufacturers ended up absorbing all the extra costs in case of any delays in their order fulfillment. In the production process, there are usually a lot of unforeseen circumstances like logistical delays, road closures, and labor strikes, which usually impact the production timelines for these manufacturers. But because most of the retailers and brands only cared about receiving their products on time and within that short time frame, manufacturers ended up covering any of the extra cost or the extra penalties associated with the delays, even though the factors were beyond their control. One of the other important things here was that retailers imposed a late discount fee on these manufacturers for any of these delays, which also heightens the risk involved in the production process for them. Because we also see that one of the key parts of this business model is short production times. It can also result in the laborers and the workers working for longer hours to meet these stringent deadlines. And this again increases the concerns about the working conditions and the employee well-being of the workers who are part of the supply chain. The next part of manufacturing challenges was managing the pricing parameters which were involved in production of fast fashion clothing. And it was seen that brands always came in with a predetermined budget constraint in mind when they were placing orders with these manufacturers. And this, I think, poses a risk of lost orders for a lot of manufacturers as well, if their pricing parameters don't align with the brands. Manufacturers who were specifically small or medium-sized ones faced significant challenges in their pricing strategies, and this was due to the capital outlays required for the production infrastructure and the factory certifications. So retailers demanded these certifications and infrastructure upfront, but they resist covering the extra cost associated with the price increase when these products come from certified factories. And this again creates a layer of additional risk for these manufacturers who have to invest in the infrastructure and who have to get their factories certified, and yet we see that there is no way to recoup these costs due to the resistance from the brands themselves to pay the premium associated with the certified factories. One of the quotes which I've added here was from a manufacturer based in Mumbai, and he said that for somebody or my competitor who does not have all the certifications, their product will cost 10 to 15 rupees cheaper. So sometimes he might be able to get that buyer. And I think this itself demonstrates how manufacturers might sometimes lose buyers if they increase the prices due to these certifications. And we see that there is very limited to no incentive associated with getting the factories certified for social compliance for these manufacturers. The third part of manufacturing challenges was payment risk. And I think this has been one of the topics that has been very widely covered by the news outlets and a lot of advocacy groups who work in this area, which is of retailers not making payments on time to their manufacturers. And in a lot of cases, retailers making no payments at all for months after the delivery of the products, despite the payment terms being in the contract. And this situation is particularly taxing for small-scale manufacturers, as they lack the resources to take any legal actions against these large corporations. In addition to this, since the factories have already invested in raw materials, labor, and wages to fulfill these orders, it can therefore be very difficult for them to manage the financial burden associated with any future orders that might be coming up. In addition to this, delayed payments from retailers also translate to future delayed payment for workers, because I think these cases again exemplify this trickle-down effect in the supply chain, where if the brands do not pay up on time, the manufacturers do not pay their workers, and it eventually affects the fair compensation terms, which most brands do want their factories to comply with. However, we see that brands themselves do not consistently adhere to any of these payment terms. The second set of finding which I want to talk about again is related to these certifications and compliance for sustainability. And it was seen that major fast fashion brands, but also some of the major domestic brands in India, preferred social compliance and certified factories, but at the same time, there were no mandatory compliance related to any of the environmental benchmarks, because occasionally manufacturers would be asked to source from suppliers who had their organic fabric certifications, or they would have to occasionally test their fabrics for purity. But other than that, there were no other environmental benchmarks imposed on the manufacturing units. When I talk about social compliance here, it mainly refers to no child labor, optimal working conditions, and fair wages in the factories. So it was observed that these compliance benchmarks were also perceived as unrealistic by a lot of manufacturers because, according to them, they did not consider any of the local circumstances of India and the manufacturing realities on ground. Many also considered this as a frustrating factor associated with compliance because it was not always feasible for them to incorporate all the compliance measures and benchmarks as it is. One of the quotes from the manufacturers which I've added here, he was a Delhi-based manufacturer who was mainly producing for Zara, and he said that, you know, if you're asking a person for 1,000 square feet space to move 200 square feet and build toilet blocks because this is required for compliance, he might not be able to or willing to do that. And I think this again shows the seriousness of the situation, but also what they mean by unrealistic standards when they talk about compliance. In addition to this, we also see that there was again no incentive for the manufacturing factories to even invest their own capital and resources to make these factories compliant, because brands again do not guarantee any future orders if the factory do get themselves certified. So because we see that a lot of manufacturers were frustrated because of how the compliance standards were unrealistic according to them, we see that they have now started manipulating the data to get the certifications and also maintain these sustainability certifications. So this is what I call in this study a non-compliance adjustment, which mainly refers to the alterations made by actors within the supply chain to align with the certifications without strictly complying with them. All the manufacturers who were interviewed, they stated that their factories were compliant with the local laws and the Factory Act of India. However, it was a significant challenge for them to incorporate every requirement listed in the compliance benchmarks because they overlooked the local circumstances and the implementation context of the manufacturing country itself. Many manufacturers also claim to make these modifications in the implementation of these standards without actually fully complying with them, but majority of these adjustments were related to the criterias of space requirement, infrastructural facilities, and also wages. So this quote which I've added here was from an interview with a manufacturer who is mainly producing for Walmart. And he said that, you know, when you do follow these compliance benchmarks, they have to deduct provident fund and professional tax from the paychecks of their workers. But according to them, the laborers were not ready to take these deductions. So if their salary was 20,000 rupees, they would want that 20,000 in hand. And this is where he says that because of this, we have to manipulate the data when we get the certifications. Because for the certifications, they need the data to be proper. And I think this is where we see some of the problems and inefficiencies of the certifications come in. Because even though these manufacturers admitted that they were manipulating the data to maintain their certifications, it is possible that there are other manufacturers who are out there who are actually not paying their labor fairly, but at the same time maintaining their certifications because they are getting away with manipulating the data in their wage reports. So how are they getting away with doing this? So we see that, for example, if the factory is getting certified for SEDEX, the audits are usually run by third-party organizations to assess if the factory can be SEDEX approved or not. And the auditing organizations are primarily local, so manufacturers routinely get approved despite not meeting all the requirements, especially because these standards do not consider aspects of space, cost, labor management, and other local factors in India. While we see that there are just these practical limitations of operating in these regions, I also want to shift the focus to the fast fashion business model itself, because the model itself can also pose multiple limitations to actually complying with these benchmarks. So we see that despite these certifications being in place, brands themselves do not consider the constraints that they impose on manufacturers, because brands are still requiring the same high volume, cost-efficient production model in the industry, but at the same time they are not ready to slow down the production and increase the production timelines. So in my opinion, it also highlights this hypocrisy of the brands wanting compliance for their factories, but at the same time imposing strict deadlines for high volume orders on manufacturers. My third and last set of finding is associated with this regional disconnect in the certifications. And we see that many experts claimed that compliance benchmarks are developed based on the standards of living of the West, and they tend to ignore the socioeconomic conditions of the manufacturing regions themselves, especially in cities across India where space is limited and expensive. Incorporating the compliance standards as it is can be very difficult. We also see that the standards often overlook the socioeconomic realities of the manufacturing regions, which also poses as a significant barrier to compliance, and also highlights some of the systemic flaws in the way this industry is actually approaching to a more regularized way of production. Apart from the compliance, some of the experts also mentioned that there is a need to tackle the problems of overconsumption and demand in fast fashion. So this quote was from the interview with one of the directors of Clothing Manufacturing Association of India. And he said that, we are the polluters, but because we produce fast fashion, but it is also important to ask who created fast fashion. It is a hypocritical world we live in. And I think what this quote shows is that there is a need to respond to the impacts of fast fashion in a more collective manner, and it is a collective responsibility where we do need to address the consumption side as well as the production side of this industry. So just to tie everything together and talk about some of the broader significance of this study, one of the major themes that I saw in all of these interviews was that there are adverse effects on workers considering the structure of the business model itself, but also the way these sustainability standards were being implemented. We see that this deeply ingrained structure of quick and low-cost production in fast fashion reinforces meager wages, long working hours, and poor working conditions for labor who are at the bottom of the supply chain. And we see that within the fashion regime, sustainability measures may again not consistently demonstrate effectiveness when they are only applied to the manufacturing sector of the supply chain. Because just tying it back to the socio-technical regimes from multi-level perspectives, we see that there are these socio-technical configurations that are interconnected with the regime. And achieving sustainability would therefore require each of these components to change in the same direction, rather than sustainability benchmarks just applied to the manufacturing segment of production. So the first argument which I make in this study is that all segments within the supply chain of the fast fashion regime need to change in the same direction to attain sustainability, rather than again incorporating these sustainability measures in the manufacturing segment of the supply chain. The second part which I want to talk about with my conclusions is local context-driven solutions. So we see that brands often appear to be very indifferent to the operational challenges which were within the supply chain, including aspects like raw material shortages, labor strikes, and price fluctuations. And these instances demonstrate how there is disregard for the local context by brands and certifications, and it constructs ineffective systems within this regime. So the second argument which I make in this paper is the need to develop sustainability measures and benchmarks that are grounded in the local context of the manufacturing country itself. And I think this would not only ensure better effectiveness of sustainability measures, but I think grounding the solutions within the local context would also help mitigate the data manipulation activities which are taking place in the supply chain. The last topic which I want to talk about before I end the presentation is the power asymmetry which is there in the supply chains of the fast fashion brands. And we see that it is very evident, and the power imbalance is very evident as brands mainly negotiate for lower prices and shorter delivery time, placing manufacturers under the intense pressure to meet these demands. Brands also consistently exhibit this tardiness in payments, and in certain instances, they even fail to remit payments at all. And this is where we see the workers bear the brunt of these dynamics, experiencing extended working hours and low compensation. And this is where my third argument for this paper lies, is that we need to move away from this low cost and quick production business model of fast fashion to actually see any changes towards sustainability. Because when we look at the business model and the way these compliance measures are being implemented, there is this contrast in the way both of them work, because brands are still prioritizing this low cost and quick production model versus the way these compliances are incorporated into the production cycles, where they are asked to have 8 hours working days, but they are not able to meet the short deadlines imposed by the brands. So that concludes my presentation for today, and thank you everyone for patiently sitting through it.
We'll see if Oliver knows how to operate a microphone real quick. Yes, I am moderating. Are we good to go on the stick mic? All right, so if you guys are on Zoom, you are welcome to put your name in the chat. I see Monami has a hand. Do we have a hand in the room? I'm going to start out with Saul, and then we're going to go to Zoom, and we're going to alternate. Does this sound good? Excellent.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question about the kind of boundaries of your project and this concept of fast fashion. So you mentioned 3 brands, which are the kind of bottom of the barrel kind of brands, right? The ones that we think of as the kind of fastest of the fast fashion.
Yeah.
So how fast is too fast? Like how fast, like which brand, like is it all US clothing is in this category of fast fashion? Is there some place where you cut that off? And the reason I ask is because, you know, as I'm thinking about your this kind of structural question at the end, or the kind of structural solution, it's about slowing down.
Yeah.
And I guess there are elements of your analysis that really do seem to come from the speed, but there are other elements that seem to come from other kinds of structural factors that maybe slowing down are not going to fix. And so I was just wondering how you kind of navigate what's in and what's out in this analysis.
So fast fashion is, again, this business model that mainly prioritizes quick production of trendy clothes. And also their production timelines are very short because they are updating their trends every week, and they are trying to hit the market shelves with new products every 30 to 60 days. But that is what mainly fast fashion is. But in terms of boundaries, when we do talk about some of these major brands like Zara or H&M, Primark, J. Crew, I think they are still considered to be a fast fashion brand, and they still have this not ethical, but they still have certain standards where they do disclose some of the aspects of their supply chain. But when we talk about bottom of the barrel, there are other brands which are now part of the ultra fast fashion system, which has been defined in the last 1 year, where we see brands like Boho or Shein, which mainly operate out of China. And there are not even any standards which are being incorporated for any disclosures or any of the annual reports that come out for them. And the way I identified my manufacturers was actually through the list of factories which were there in the annual report of H&M and Primark and some of these brands. So that was my first way of trying to identify factories which are there. And then I sort of snowballed from there and asked the manufacturers if they can connect me to some of their competitors, and they did. So when I talk about fast fashion, I think I am not talking about the ultra fast fashion. I am actually talking about the brands who have at least some level of disclosure and who are being held accountable and who are responding to some of these problems that are being brought up by advocacy groups like Fashion Revolution. So yeah, I hope that helps. I don't know.
You have a follow-up or?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Monami, let's go to you online.
Thank you, Pratyusha. That was a really wonderful presentation, and I learned a lot. And I just actually ordered some clothes yesterday, and I remember trying to be very cognizant of whether I was ordering fast fashion or not. But my question to you is about the multi-level perspective. It's something that I'm a little bit familiar with because I sort of, read about it and wondered if it would work for me when I was writing my dissertation. And I eventually ended up not using it, but for various reasons. And I know that, the MLP comes from the Dutch tradition, and they, it's a very techno-managerial kind of perspective. And so I was wondering how you see it helpful for you. I was thinking of other methodologies that you might have used. And so like Adele Clark's situational analysis, thinking about her because of her death. And, you could have put a whole bunch of other kinds of structural factors in there, sort of like influencers and shaping what kind of fashion goes in, or fashion shows, or all of these other kinds of things. And so I wonder, what kind of theoretical purchase is the multi-level perspective gathering for you, especially since I don't think it's that widely used in STS, but maybe it is. I haven't touched it in a long time. Thank you.
Yeah. one of the reasons for using multi-level perspective was the fact that it helps me bifurcate the supply chain based on the role of the brands and manufacturers and how consumers play into it. But at the same time, it helps me get a broad overview of how some of the government organizations like UN or advocacy groups are shaping this landscape. And also we see that these new business models emerging, like some of these thrifting models and reselling models for old clothes. And I think that sort of helped me put boundaries on my study when I picked that theoretical framework, because otherwise it felt like this interconnected mess, in my opinion, because there are so many different factors associated with this. So that was also one of the ways or one of the approaches which I used to put boundaries on my research and just focus on the manufacturing and the supply chain part of the industry.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yes, Christine.
Thank you so much. This talk was so great. So to bring in other factors that you can talk about, I just would love to hear you talk a little bit about how gender showed up for you and maybe how it came up in your interviews or in your fieldwork. I'm just thinking about how you were saying that 80% of the workers are women, and if we think about the demand for fast fashion, who the consumers are, we're thinking about primarily women, right, or feminized people, not exclusively, but so that makes me have questions about, just sort of transnational feminist kind of, collaborations, and how can we think about some of these exploited people thinking together about this problem. But so I was just wondering if how it showed up for you in your own thinking and in interviews and just in your fieldwork. Thank you.
So thank you for the question. A lot of the things which I found out about gender-related aspects of labor and how there is a certain level of gender-based violence in the supply chain was through the literature. But also there were some instances where this did come up in the interviews where a lot of manufacturers mentioned that for their compliance, they were also required to give childcare facilities in the factories. And some of them mentioned that, because of the space constraints, it was not always possible for them to provide these facilities exactly based on the measurement parameters which are part of these benchmarks. But they did say that this was an active attempt for them to provide childcare facilities in whatever way they can for some of the female workers who were there in their factories. Another aspect which I did touch upon with those manufacturers was the aspect of how maternity leaves play into the manufacturing side of things. And we see that because a lot of this labor comes from below poverty line, and they do not have means to support themselves or their families. They actively do not want to take these maternity leaves, and they prefer to come to work because having some money is better than not getting paid at all. A lot of times with these women, we also see that they are the sole earners for their family, because a lot of their husbands are either not working or not doing anything. And this was just the information that came in from the manufacturers. But I do want to extend this study at some point and do labor interviews to explore how the supply chain impacts the female labor moving forward.
We have a question online from Fabian, and then we're going to go to Matt. So Fabian asks, he says, great work, Pratyusha. Can you tell us a little about how fast fashion corporations chose India for manufacturing?
Yeah, so this reminds me of this interview which I had with the Clothing Manufacturing Association of India. And when we were talking about the Indian market, he said that the way they positioned themselves in the manufacturing market was not right, according to them, because initially, 20 years back, when they were trying to make this industry as one of the industries which actually produces employment for the country. At that time, they were marketing it as a very low cost production country. And that was one of the ways they also got a lot of their orders in initially. But at the same time, when I looked at the economic data and the commerce data from the government of India, I also saw that a major part of their GDP, not as significant as Bangladesh, but a major part of their GDP was associated with textile trade and ready-made garments. So that was one reason, and also the ease of it, because I am from India, so there were no language barriers to conduct these interviews and get a sneak peek into how the supply chain works. So that was another reason for me to choose India.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk and learned a lot from it. And I was most impressed you were able to get these people to talk to you. And my question is about their responses, because I think if you boil down the things that they all said, in each case it was, it's not my fault. And my suspicion is if you went and talked to the designers, they would say, look, it's not my fault. They tell us they're doing it, but on the ground, what they're doing, I can't police that. Yeah. And as you said, like if you were to go to the workers, they're going to say, I just want to work. I need to work, and stop trying to do this. So I guess my question is what do you do with that, and how would a regulatory response or an industry internal response deal with that? And I guess I'll ask in the last way is, was the system intentionally designed so that everyone could say, it's not my fault?
I think the system was very smartly designed so that the risk is pushed down to the bottom of the supply chain. Because as we can see in the way this business model has been designed is that brands do not own any factories. So there were instances where in the reports which I've read, brands were actually questioned based on the practices which were happening in some of these manufacturing units and some of the human rights violations that were taking place in these factories. And the way brands responded was the fact that, the way we gave our contracts to these factories, they were certified. So for them, it's like, we are good. Like, we don't take any responsibility because my next in line is the manufacturer who is certified. So they are fine. But because there is also this traceability issue in this industry, when a manufacturer is subcontracting his work to somebody else, there is no way to track it. So even if he is compliant and he has a certified factory, there is no way to find out if the work which is being subcontracted to somebody else, if there are any human rights violations in those factories. So I think the way the system is designed is that there are some organized parts of it, but the major part of this industry is also unorganized and untraceable. And I think that is where the problem lies with this industry, because of how fragmented it is and how spread out it is. So I don't know if it completely answers your question, but in terms of what can be done, I think one of the ways to address this is to incorporate better accountability parameters, which are again designed in a way that it supports the operational barriers of the manufacturing country itself, because we are seeing these data manipulation practices in the factories that are certified. So even though we consider certifications being a way of better transparency and accountability within these systems, we are also seeing how these actors are always getting around it by some way or the other. So I think we need alternative models to actually address this problem.
Can I ask one quick informational follow-up? When you were talking to these manufacturers, did they mention the traceability question, and do they have opinions on how to make things more traceable?
No, because they don't want their supply chains to be traced, right? So they were not really engaging with that part of it, but I did ask some of them that can you yourself track or trace your own supply chain. So only like a handful of manufacturers said that they do keep a record of everyone they are engaging with, and they report all of that. And they were mainly manufacturing for H&M for the past 10 years. So they said that even the fast fashion brands do have a way to do it. But again, unfortunately, most of the brands do not follow up with their manufacturers on the extended supply chain.
We don't have anyone online, so anyone in the room have a question? Yeah.
So I think I have a lowball question for you. Can you just talk us through what the interview process, like what that was like, moving from Zoom to in person, and how you actually achieved that?
Yeah. So initially, I started off just sending emails to these manufacturers to get them to talk to me. And initially, I did not receive any response from them. I also sent emails to a lot of these labor organizations. And again, none of them replied. So this one day, I just called one of the manufacturers to get him to talk to me because the number was on their website. So he did talk to me, and he did give me a time to talk. But again, it was not more than 10 minutes. So they either had to go or they were too busy with their work to spend time with me and talk about this. And another problem was me wanting to record all the interviews. So a lot of them did not want to be recorded, and they just did not like the concept of me not being there, but also being recorded, and they were not sure how it will be used. So at that point, I was just able to get, I think, 3 interviews done on Zoom, which were no more than 10 minutes long in a period of 2 to 3 months. So that felt a little counterproductive to me. So I just decided to go and do it in person. And initially, when I did reach India, I did have a few interviews lined up because I called them and took a time from them to go and meet them in person. And they were very open to it if I was going in person. And after that, I just asked them if they can put me in touch with any of the other manufacturers who they deal with. And that was one of the ways I tried to get more people to talk to me. In addition to that, I also, when I was reaching out to the experts who were there, who were working in the nonprofit organizations, they were a lot more receptive to the idea of spending time with me to talk about these issues. So I was able to get another interview done with Fashion Revolution India, which was over an hour long, and she was okay with me recording it. And she did give me a lot of insight into how they work and how there were some of these key issues in the supply chain.
To follow up on that, so do you feel like most of your ethnography was formal interviews, or did you also do observation of the facilities? Did you sort of hang out with them or do informal interviews? Did you interview any of the laborers?
No, I did not interview any of the labor. Also because in my IRB, I did not take permission to do so. But I also did not do any observation study because, again, that required elaborate amount of time and permissions, because in a lot of these factories, they have designs from these brands where they do not want anybody from the outside to see these designs and potentially copy it. So that was another problem with actually conducting observational studies there. But majority of the interviews were sit-down formal interviews. But I did keep the questionnaire very open-ended, and I was trying to go off of what they were telling me, just to get to know more about some of the problems within the supply chain.
Do you think it was, so you were saying earlier, that these factories are disconnected from the greater organizations like H&M and Zara. So do you think that made it easier for your ethnography because you're not having to get permission from organizations like H&M and Zara, which might have a greater sort of security?
Yeah, and the way this business model is designed, they do not own any of the factories. So beyond the contract of their production, they cannot dictate any terms of how these factories are working with other clients or talking to anyone. So it did become easier for me to go and talk to these manufacturers who were producing for these brands. And fortunately, they were very open about taking names of the brands and discussing some of the problems which they face with them.
Cool. Well, great project.
I'm going to go to a question online right before you. So Fabian, another question. He asks, can you say more about your idea of alternative views to certification? Do you think your work as an STS researcher can be used in that direction?
Alternatives to certifications, I think there have been some talks lately about incorporating blockchain into the accountability process of fast fashion. So that was just something new which I read, but on my own, I think that there needs to be a certain parameter, or there are certain requirements by the local governments to actually be able to trace the way some of this money is moving around and how these orders and subcontracting is working in this industry, because as we see that a lot of manufacturers were also not very open to the idea of Western certifications being imposed on them. And I think developing solutions which were also closely related to the way local governments work in these countries, I think that might be a more that might lead to a more fruitful solution to this problem, rather than just somebody else in a different part of the world making these certifications and imposing it to a manufacturing country which is completely on the other side of the earth. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I have a kind of sort of a follow-up question to that, which is thinking about sort of modes of action in response to what you're finding. So, there's sort of different levels of response. One is a kind of market response, right, which is to sort of say, oh, let's create market pressure or new kinds of markets, and that's, I think, certification in some ways is a kind of market response.
Yeah.
There are policy responses, which are about creating policies that hold, again, depending on where the policy sits, whether it's in the manufacturing country or the brand's sort of home country, that seeks to hold account the kind of companies themselves for their actions and behaviors. There's a very political response, which is, either unionization or burning the thing down or, whatever it is. And I was just, so I was just wondering what kinds of insights you've gotten from your study, because one kind of response is, the made in USA. It's like, oh, let's sort of pull out of that whole kind of global fashion industry and just, bring it home, and then we can kind of self-regulate, and you don't have this sort of attenuated supply chains and all that. But that, of course, has potential problems for these manufacturing companies or the workers themselves, right, in certain ways. So I was just wondering, given the sort of global complexity of what you're looking at, where are the levers for change, and what that don't end up making the situation, whatever the situation is, right? And there's lots of different situations, worse.
Yeah. I think most of the problem lies in the intricacies of global trade to start with, and then how these countries themselves are administering some of these issues. Because when we talk about global trade to start with, these countries are giving a lot of incentives to these brands to actually come in and produce here. So they are incorporating these parameters into their production zones where labor unions cannot be formed. So you have these economic zone regions in countries like Bangladesh and India where forming labor union is not legal. And major brands do, give contracts for production in these regions because they also get a tax rebate. And they do not have to pay customs and so many other things. So there is this set of problem associated with international trade. But at the same time, how some of the local policies work, because local governments or the regional governments are still incentivizing these industries to come in and produce, but at the same time, not very efficiently regulating the regional market which is there. And I think there are not a lot of accountability parameters incorporated into these local laws where they can hold some of these organizations accountable. But another problem when we talk about the local aspects of the supply chain is the fact that because it is so fragmented, a lot of times these manufacturers are employing labor who are not even on the payroll. So when you do not have people on the payroll, there is no trace, no paper trace. I think it becomes even more challenging to address it. So I think there are two sides to it, but we also need to start from addressing the issues locally and then moving on to some of the global parameters associated with regularizing this industry.
We have a hand from Monami online again, so I'm going to alternate. Monami, I'm going to hand it over to you again, and then we'll go to Christine next.
Okay, thank you. I think I have two questions. One is that, Pratyusha, you said you spoke to NGOs, expertise in NGOs, right?
Yeah.
And what was it called? Fashion
Revolution.
Forward? Revolution. Yeah. And I was wondering, you know, in thinking about fashion and textiles, like just because I've had to read a lot about him, Gandhi always comes to mind, right? In his idea of having, you know, small cottage industry. And I know that Gandhianism has waned a lot for various reasons, but is this something that NGOs think about when they do they have this sort of imaginary in their minds of how to counteract any of this, this globalization of the fashion industry? Is that something that they talk about? And the second question was about analogs that you might find in other kinds of industry that India is implicated in globally, like you know, clinical trials, for example, or any of the other kinds of ways that there's a lack of accountability. Just because it seems like, you know, one of the answers you seem to be implicitly posing is that a lot of these issues, because of the fragmentation, could be solved with knowing more about it, to have better data. And that is always something that we tend to be suspicious about, because more data doesn't necessarily lead to better action. Sometimes it's not, you know, not anti-data, but you know, this kind of idea that if we just knew more about who's on the payroll, it will lead to good outcomes instead of more surveillance. So I was wondering about analogs that might help think about that, as well as this idea of Gandhianism.
Yeah. So to respond to the first part of the question, when I did talk to these nonprofit organizations, majority of, specifically with Fashion Revolution, majority of their projects were related to increasing the welfare of workers who are mainly part of the handicrafts of India, because I think that is where the strength of Indian manufacturing lies, which is with embroidery, hand block printing, and the amount of artisans who are there. So their agendas, I mean, I think it's loosely connects to the way Gandhi would describe it, but I think that's where most of their conservation projects or some of their projects to improve the conditions of these workers was stemming from, which was to empower them through their own art. But talking about the second part of the question, I think when I talk about tracing the supply chain, it is a significant problem in the fashion industry, which is traceability, because if we do not know how the supply chain is designed and where it is going, I think it would be very difficult to actually design policies or design solutions for it. So I think I don't think it would lead to any unintended consequences related to surveillance, but I think having that transparency of, where are these workers located, who are these workers, what kind of problems they are facing is also part of the traceability and transparency talk within the production supply chains of the industry.
And just to say real quick, that's a great answer because that gets into sort of the citizen science and undone science stuff that needs to be done but is not being done by anybody. Or maybe it is, I don't know. But.
Okay, I just have another question. We have a lot of questions for you. And this is just a genuine sort of question from you about maybe where you are with this topic and this project at this point. I don't know if it's compared with before you started, but I feel so struck by, for me, the almost incompatibility between the word sustainable and fast fashion. Like, they don't feel like they can coexist in the same sentence, and I think you're asking us to think about that.
Yeah.
And so I'm just thinking about, is there a place you want to land, or is there another place you want to look, or another aspects of this that you address in the dissertation about sort of what we do with that, right? Like alongside the accountability and, better tracing. I think what you've been talking about in terms of like untraceable workers, I mean, this is amazing. And then, so I'm just sort of juxtaposing that with waste and hyperconsumption and sort of like the stakes of these invisible people to produce these new clothing lines once a week, right? Like this is nuts, right? Like what we're talking about. So I think I just want to make sure that we're not holding like a weekly fashion line stable in all of this, right? That we just have that on the table as well. I don't mean you, I mean all of us.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to hear you maybe talk about that a little bit, and just whether you encountered, kind of degrowth in some of the stuff that you read, and just the consumption, the consumption piece of this.
Yeah. I think that's a great question because it helps me sort of flush out my arguments very well. So rightly so, because when we do talk about the compliance and sustainability and then I compare it with the business model, there is a very significant disconnect because despite of these brands still wanting their factories to be compliant, their business model does not support the compliance measures. And I think that is where the major problem lies. But that is also one of the reasons we see greenwashing in this industry so much, because they want to be perceived as being sustainable, but they are actually not. And more importantly, it is not just what they are doing, but the way their business model is designed, where they are making profits off of these micro trends. I think that itself is the major part of the problem. So if we do talk about sustainability, that would require us or require them to move from this fast fashion model to a slow fashion model. Because all of these benchmarks which are designed for these compliances actually incorporate the concept of slow production and like 8 hours working days for these workers. But at the same time, when these brands are imposing short deadlines on them, it is very difficult for them to comply with these deadlines. So this is where I think one of the examples where we see this disconnect, that they require one thing, but they are not ready to make changes in their own business model. And on top of that, what I just mentioned about greenwashing, another way brands talk about sustainability is through their materials, or when they launch these sustainability lines within their brand. And I think that is another attempt to greenwashing, because if you were to actually pick up the product composition tag and look at it, only 5% of a particular sweater would be real wool and everything else will be polyester. And they end up selling those sweaters in their sustainability lines. And this again is the testament to the type of greenwashing that takes place by these brands, because nobody is ready to take the hit on their bottom line. in my opinion, because this is, if you look at it just from the business perspective, in my opinion, it is a very well thought out business model because you have no risk and you accrue the highest amount of profits here. So every time we talk about sustainability, brands always hike up the price by 70% for their price tags. And I think there is this significant disconnect with the idea that sustainable clothing has to be very expensive. And I think that is where they also add a layer of accessibility barrier for the consumers to actually be able to make that shift towards sustainability. Because nobody wants to buy expensive clothes or nobody wants to spend $100 on a sweater when they can get it for 20. So that is, I think, these are some of the techniques which, in my opinion, brands incorporate to keep that business model going. And I am not sure like how we would solve this if the brands are not ready to make a shift in their business model itself. So, yeah.
I have some questions, but I don't know if others wanted to.
We'll go to Matt, and then we'll come back to the Zoom.
So this follows up on what Saul started, and I think Monami was contributing to, and then Christine put on the table, which is, I mean, I think in your picture, H&M should go away and Walmart should go away, but I don't think that at least that's how you're kind of presenting it. So I'm wondering if what you're trying to tell us is that, you know what, H&M and Walmart should go back to being vertically integrated corporations where they can trace things out. And I'd just be curious, like from a business school side of things, whether that is the argument you're trying to make. And then I'll ask a second question, kind of semi-related, is if you were to present this work in like the most digestible fashion to a public audience, is your audience the industry? Is it these other clothing activist organizations, and what do you want to tell them?
So just to respond to the second part of the question, I think my audience is mainly policymakers, the brands themselves, but also the consumers, because I think there is very limited awareness about the seriousness of the situation. But at the same time, a lot of policymakers are also not aware of what is actually happening within these supply chains. So I think with this study, what I try to do is to show how inefficiently some of these sustainability benchmarks are working, because one of the ways the industry looks at sustainability is by thinking that they can certify these manufacturing units and that would solve a lot of their problems. But at the same time, we have seen that actors have found their way around it. And I think this also shows the ineffectiveness of the way some of these policies have been designed. And I think it is important to talk about this topic is solely to understand what are the problems and what are the challenges in actually making this huge shift for this industry, which is over 300 billion in revenue, to make this shift and move towards a model which is supposedly sustainable. So, yeah. And what was the first part of the question?
The first, that was a great answer. And sorry, that was a great answer. The first part is, one kind of counterintuitive read on everything you've just said is that, we should want H&M and Walmart to be a vertically integrated company. So, because in that situation, you would be able to trace down you could blame them.
Yeah, I think if the supply chain is traceable, you can blame certain actors, but I think what it increases is accountability in the system, because if some of these actors are being held accountable, designing solutions to address these problems is going to be much easier compared to if we have a supply chain where there is no way to understand what is the limit to it and how it extends beyond certain countries.
Because if we can blame them, we can also applaud them.
Well, I mean, I guess to put it simply, is vertical integration more responsible than decentralized global stuff?
I had a bit of a follow-up to that, so if
Okay,
I
we're gonna
can
go to
go for-
Sarish and then we'll go online. How about that?
All right, thank you so much.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, so my family's business is small-scale manufacturing of clothes in Pakistan. So I know a little, like me and Pratyusha, we were talking about it, and I knew a little bit about how those manufacturings go. So for example, if my family, like my uncle, whenever he's producing, if he's selling it in one zone, it's significantly marked down versus if he's selling it just in a more expensive zone in Karachi, where it can be like sold for a 200% premium, which is like how these profits work. So I feel like one of my, like, it's sort of a question and sort of like a hypothetical. It's like, because these are so fragmented across a nation, so we're like, the production is happening in India where per production cost of each item is quite low, it's in rupees, and then we go into US where the per item cost becomes into dollars, and then just the inherent differences in all of these like zones, they add up profit for the upper sort of the entities existing at the top of the pyramid versus like a lot of risk for the entities at the bottom of the pyramid. So I suppose like in these senses, just because of the way this is designed, there's like this tension between like if you apply an ad hoc policy on top of it, it really is not working because then people are just like making their own numbers to make it policy compliant. So policy is not looking at things, and you look at it very nicely in the local context. So I guess my sort of question was, is policy the right way to go with this, or are there like other completely different solutions? I mean, I'm sure you don't have all the answers. It's just sort of like a thought experiment that I'm trying to do here.
Yeah, I don't think policy is 100% or the complete solution to this problem, because also policies beyond a certain point cannot control how these larger corporations work. But I think because we do have advocacy organizations who play a very significant role in this industry to actually increase awareness, and when there is certain level of awareness in the consumers, it does create market opportunity for other players to come in who might be more ethical in their approach. But at the same time, because most of these brands do not want to lose out on business and they want to tap into this market where the consumers are more aware of the social impact and the environmental impact of this industry, some of these brands also try and attempt to make a change in the way they are working. And I think at some point, I mean, again, like you said, I do not have all the answers, but I do think that brands have the capability to make a shift, and maybe at some point, instead of taking 70% profit of each piece of clothing, they can come down to 50 and at the same time pay all the workers. It is very difficult to incorporate, and again, there is no way to know because we have traceability issues in this industry, but I think at some point businesses would have to take a step towards addressing some of these problems. I know it does not answer your question, but
my question was very good.
Yeah.
Awesome. So Fernanda online has a question, so I'm gonna toss it to her.
Hi, Pratyusha. Very nice to see your presentation. Understanding better who is your is your focus and your audience. I was thinking, knowing how much you like design issues and how critical thinker you are, if you have been thinking of design responses to this problem, because I don't know if policymakers do not know what is going on, actually, because of all this advocacy groups and all these amazing reports we have around, we kind of have a sense of how these things may be terrible in the global south. And that's also the reason why we have the standards and the compliance systems that in the global north are established. So then these companies may have their name well placed in the market. So I wonder if you have been thinking of design responses to the supply chain, like if you have been reflecting on other ways of talking about this problem to this to your audience, like the industry, the policymakers.
I just have a quick clarification question. Like when you say design, is it like design of the clothes or the way the industry is designed, or it can be anything?
Yeah, it can be anything, but you showed the supply chain as a system, and you sometimes you said, oh, the system is very well designed or is designed to give this answer. So I was thinking more in terms of the system, but you can answer in terms of the clothes or anything.
Yeah, in terms of the supply chain, when I talk about design, or if I have to think about solutions from the perspective of design, I think I would incorporate traceability parameters into the way this supply chain is already existing, because I don't see, or I have not really thought about how we can redesign the entire supply chain for this, because there are so many actors involved, like cotton production taking place in one region of India, then it's going to the mills to make them into fabrics, and then it is going to a dyeing center. So there are so many different components to this, and everyone has their unique set of responsibilities to fulfill and duties to fulfill when we talk about the supply chain. But I think one of the more efficient designs for this supply chain would be, again, incorporating better traceability parameters to see, again, where some of these actors are located and how they are connected to the other stakeholders in the supply chain. In terms of design aspect for the clothes itself, I think there are alternative business models that are coming up. So their supply chains look completely different compared to a fast fashion business's supply chain. And a lot of these brands are emerging where they have a supply chain which is very transparent, and they are doing end-to-end production in very specific factories and in limited number of factories. So they are able to trace their supply chain, but at the same time they are incorporating transparency in their pricing parameters and developing clothing lines that are more timeless, rather than in fast fashion where clothes are very trendy and they are just good for like the next few months, and then you throw it away and go to the next trend which is there. So I think in terms of design, there are completely separate set of supply chains which are there now, which focus on these timeless pieces which can be worn by people for a very elongated periods of time compared to the consumer behavior that takes place when they consume fast fashion. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pratyusha.
Can I ask one more quick question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just super quick. I was just curious because I've just been thinking about the Rana Plaza collapse, right? And that was just 10, 11 years ago. I just was wondering if anyone that you talked to talked about that as a before and after kind of moment. That's,
yeah.
I promise I'm done.
Yeah, the manufacturers did talk about it because they said that most of this pressure for social compliance came in after 2013. And I think Rana Plaza took place in 2011, and within 2 years.
2013.
Okay, so during 2013 period, that's when most of this pressure to actually, look at the working conditions of people and actually focus on these problems was an important part of their everyday operations. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We are at time. We do have a couple comments on Zoom. Monami commented on vertical integration as well. I can send you these comments later if you want. And I'm sure you can all follow up with Pratyusha afterwards. So let's give her a round of applause. And a reminder that we do not have a seminar next week. Please enjoy spring break. The week after that,